Hello, everyone, and welcome to one of the first sessions of NABIG 2021. My name is Waleed, and I'll be your moderator for this morning or very early morning, depending on where you are in the country, or maybe you're not even in North America at all and you're elsewhere. But welcome, and we're very excited to share an exciting list of speakers with you today. If you're like me, you might get caught up in all of the numbers behind basic income, all of the data and the facts that help us make our case as basic income advocates. But while these are important, sometimes it leads us to overlook the stories of the people that are at the heart of the movement. And our speakers today will highlight the importance of speaking to these personal stories in basic income advocacy, and will focus on the lives of various people who've had their lives changed for the better due to basic income. Before we dive in, I just want to provide a few housekeeping items. On the right-hand side, you will see a chat where you can share any interesting information or thoughts about what the speakers are saying. In the bottom right corner, you will also see an Ask a Question button. If you have any questions, please put them there rather than in the chat, because that helps us keep them all in the same place and increases the likelihood that your question will get answered. You can also vote on the questions there, which will help us prioritize in case we have too many questions to go through. But that's about it. I think we're just about ready to kick things off. I'd like to begin by introducing our first speakers, Dr. Evelyn L and Hannah Owczar. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that. I've known Hannah for a long time, and I feel like I should know this by now. But I'd like to introduce Evelyn and Hannah. Beginning by introducing Evelyn, who is highlighted on your screen now. She is a professor of economics and community health sciences at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. Her research examines the health and social implications of poverty and inequality. She is often called upon by governments, First Nations, and international organizations to advise on poverty, inequality, health, and social outcomes. In addition to her most recent book, she is also the author of Basic Income for Canadians: From the COVID-19 Emergency to Financial Security for All. Hannah, and if you could, I'll highlight her on the screen now, is a writer and communication specialist in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Manitoba. She's a graduate of the Creative Communications program at Red River College, where she majored in journalism. Her writing has also appeared in several major news outlets in Manitoba, including the Winnipeg Free Press and CBC News. She holds an undergrad degree in human rights from the University of Winnipeg. She is also a member of the Basic Income Canada Youth Network Steering Committee. So that's enough for me. The one thing that I forgot to mention is they are co-authors of the upcoming book, Radical Trust: Basic Income for Complicated Lives, which is coming out in July. And that is what they will be focusing a lot of the discussion on today. So I will kick things off. Hannah, Evelyn, who wants to start?
I think I'll start. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm delighted to be joining you from Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. Our goal when we began this project was to address the criticism of basic income that we hear more and more often in Canada. Some critics argue that basic income can't possibly work because the circumstances of people who live with poverty are so very diverse. Their lives, we're told, are just too complicated for a one-size-fits-all approach like basic income. These critics tell us that the only way to address the real needs of people living with poverty is to set up a system of wraparound care that recognizes the complexity of poverty and addresses its root causes. Now, we want to be clear before we begin. We're certainly not suggesting that basic income eliminates the needs for public services. We know services are necessary, but we also think that people need money that they can spend to meet the needs that they identify, that they believe are the most pressing in their own lives. So we began this project with the idea that we'd talk to the experts, that is, people living complicated lives with low incomes. And by complicated lives, we mean the very people that the critics of basic income worry most about. People who use substances, people who've just been released from prison, young people who are aging out of foster care, people living with violence in their intimate lives or with systemic violence of the sort that affects Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, people who are precariously housed, and many, many others. What we really didn't expect was the profound education we received from some incredibly generous witnesses. We expected to hear, and we did in fact hear, the one thing that every one of our witnesses needed was money that they could spend any way they wanted to spend it. Money that they didn't need to account for by producing receipts or to apply for through special programs. Money that couldn't be snatched away because a caseworker decided they were spending it incorrectly or couldn't be trusted or were somehow unworthy of support. So a lot of our witnesses talked about how basic income would allow them to escape the coercion that characterizes so many of the programs we put in place that are supposed to be helping people. Basic income, they argued, would allow them to live their own lives the way they wanted to live them and to make their own decisions on their own timetable. And that's where our title comes from. We think that basic income is really about extending trust to people that our society usually tries to control. And that's a challenge sometimes. And it's especially a challenge for those of us who live privileged lives. So the conversations we've had over the past year certainly forced me to think hard about some of my own biases and preconceptions. Some of them I knew about, some of them I had no idea about until we started talking to people. And I really hope that the book, when it comes out, makes some of you as uncomfortable as it's made me. And with that, I think I'm going to hand the mic over to Hannah. Thanks very much.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully this works. All right. Okay, so today I will be presenting one of the stories we collected for this project. So as Evelyn mentioned, we approached this project with the intent to have people with lived experience be the experts. All the participants in this book had a willingness to share their stories in hopes of affecting change, and many are community leaders who have presented their stories to media and other groups in the past. The stories people shared with us are important, and we are grateful for the generosity of our witnesses. We struggled with the content of some of these stories as we tried to understand a little bit better how we fit into the narrative. We write from a place of privilege that isn't always comfortable to acknowledge. We want to be clear that we did not give people a voice. They have their own voices, and the purpose in writing this book was to help other people like us, who occupy positions of privilege and sometimes have the ear of policymakers, to understand why a basic income is a necessary feature of a just society. Unlike the works of the panelists here today, those interviewed in our book have never had a basic income and were not part of the Ontario Basic Income Pilot Project. So with that being said, today I want to introduce you to one of the experts in our book who has given us permission to share her story with you all today. I would like you to meet Alea McIver. Alea identifies as an Indigenous, transgender, and Two-Spirit person. She's an advocate, a community leader, and a survivor of sexual exploitation and human trafficking. Alea's story starts in her home community of Sandy Bay First Nation on Treaty 1 territory located in Manitoba. Alea was apprehended by Child Welfare Services at 12 years old. She says her welfare worker gave her two choices, either stay in her community at a foster home or move to the city of Winnipeg. At the time, she says she was enticed by the city, being from a small community, and so she chose to move to Winnipeg. Alea says her child welfare worker bought her a one-way Greyhound bus ticket and told her to never come back. She says she considers this worker to be her first human trafficker. When she arrived at a bus depot in downtown Winnipeg, no one was there to receive her. She says she had no idea where to go or what to do, and this led Alea to her first encounter in the survival sex industry. She was lured by a man outside of the bus depot who convinced her to get in his car. He took advantage of her position and abused her. After paying her, her abuser dropped her off at a convenience store in Winnipeg's Exchange District and drove off. From there, she was taken in by sex traffickers and sold across the country. Alea, who's now 38, spent more than a decade in the survival sex industry, and she says she experienced high levels of violence, poverty, homelessness, and substance use. She says that at any point she could have been an NABIG2S statistic. She's been personally impacted by this epidemic. Her best friend Divis went missing and was murdered while working in the survival sex industry, and her cousin was murdered in her home community at just 32 years old. This sparked Alea's desire to raise awareness and be a voice for those women and two-spirit people who had died or gone missing, and she now organizes an annual NMIWG2S Memorial Day walk in Winnipeg. She's also a strong advocate for Indigenous, women, transgender, and two-spirit communities. But Alea not only speaks about the violence perpetrated by individuals, she also notes that violence can exist in systems too. Colonial violence has been perpetrating violence against Indigenous people through oppressive policies for more than 150 years, as reported by the TRC. This includes, but is certainly not limited to, the Indian Act, the residential school system, the outlawing of Indigenous spiritual practices, and the 60s scoop. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls reports on the way systems cause harm to Indigenous people and notes that poverty is one of the most violent forms of oppression. The National Inquiry's groundbreaking final report calls for the federal government to establish a guaranteed livable income for all Canadians to ensure equal access to economic and social needs. Alea says a basic income would move a lot of Indigenous women, transgender, and two-spirit people out of survival mode. She says a basic income would have given her the opportunity to heal sooner and create a better life for herself outside of the survival sex industry. Alea told us how public services and supports felt like systems of coercion and failed to address her unique needs. Alea says a basic income would offer her the ability to find solutions to her own needs without having a system or a person determine what's best for her. Again, we want to reiterate that a basic income is not a silver bullet, but offered alongside other important social services, it can provide people choice, space, and freedom. No one should be forced into the survival sex industry just so they can eat or keep a roof over their head. Alea's story is just one of many included in our upcoming book, Radical Trust. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you'll pick up a copy when it comes out.
Thank you very much, Evelyn and Hannah, for sharing that with us. As horrific as that story was, I think it's really important that we get stories like that out there. Just a really helpful reminder that lots of people live really complicated lives, like you say, and even though there's no simple solutions and basic income wouldn't be a silver bullet, it can make a huge difference in the lives of people like the ones that you just highlighted now. And I know for one, I will definitely be picking up the book, and I'm sure many of the audience will be as well. Our next speakers are the co-authors of another book about basic income called The Case for Basic Income, Freedom, Security, and Justice, which was recently released. They have also been longtime mentors of mine since my days at Queen's University, and I'm very excited to introduce them. Our first speaker is Jamie Swift, who is a Kingston writer and author of numerous books. He was a finalist of the 2017 Writers' Trust of Canada's Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing. He has lectured at Queen's University Smith School of Business, where we first met, produced documentaries for CBC Radio's Ideas, held the Missioner Fellowship for Public Service Journalism, and written widely for newspapers and magazines. In 1995, he joined a weekly social justice vigil at Kingston City Hall, standing for 20 years in solidarity with people targeted by poor bashing governments, which led to his interest in basic income. And his co-author is Elaine Power, who is a professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies and the head of the Department of Gender Studies at Queen's University. She is a founding member of the Kingston Action Group for a Basic Income Guarantee, and her and Jamie work very closely together at Queen's and the Kingston Basic Income Group to advocate for a basic income. So without further ado, I will pass it off to them. Who'll be kicking us off? Jamie, Elaine?
I think Elaine will kick it off.
Okay, great. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Waleed. It's so delightful to be on this panel and to have you hosting, but also such an honor to be with Hannah and Evelyn and Leah. I will definitely be buying Evelyn and Hannah's book when it comes out. As Waleed mentioned, Jamie and I are co-authors of this book, which came out just over a month ago, The Case for Basic Income, freedom, security, justice, and it features some of the stories of the Ontario Basic Income pilot participants. So I noticed in the chat people had been at the previous session about the pilot. So if you want more info, you could check out our book, and we will talk a bit about it in the few minutes we have. I feel like we're maybe preaching to the choir this morning, but thank you everybody for coming. I'm in Kingston, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples. And it's part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty. I've been teaching at Queen's now for 17 years. For many years, I taught a course called The Social Determinants of Health, where we talked about basic income right from the start, actually, when I first started teaching it in 2004. And what became clear really quickly is that the facts and figures, the graphs and the quantitative data only goes so far, especially with 18 and 19-year-olds. So I started using stories. We actually started using a novel in that class to tell stories of people and how things like poverty and homelessness, colonialism and racism impacts people's health. And in the social determinants of health literature, there's actually research that shows that when you present evidence or data, quantitative data to people that doesn't fit in their ideological worldview of how their framework for how the world works, not only do they reject the data, but they actually cling to their worldview even more tightly. So the data, that quantitative data, it can have perverse effects actually. And so one of the ways that to bypass that is through stories, and stories speak I think to our hearts more than our heads. And so that's one way to kind of crack the resistance to the data, because we have incredible amount of data that shows that basic income is really harmful to health and would save us a lot of money. Poverty is really harmful to health, and that basic income would save us a lot of money over the long term. So I think, there's probably some segments of the population that we're never going to convince, but it's the ones in the middle that I think we can really attract with stories. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie.
Okay, thanks, Elaine. Let's keep this relatively brief so we have lots of time for questions. The stories in our book are a modest attempt to be accountable to people who have historically not counted or not been counted. And those stories have not only not been counted, they have never even been told. I'm going to talk a bit about Hamilton. So through the Hamilton Roundtable on Poverty Reduction, for our American friends, Hamilton was one of the 3 cities in Ontario where the basic income pilot was tried. Through the roundtable, low-income people have been trying to seize the means of production of the stories, of their own stories, and have worked hard to show themselves as active participants in society and not just as victims, and not as victims, but as active, living, breathing people. And these are people who have too often lived in a world of narrative scarcity, indeed of story inequality. So I think what we talk about in the story of the Hamilton Roundtable is that it has tried in a determined and relentless fashion to amplify the voices of low-income people through first Speak Now, then a Speakers Bureau, and finally through living proof, a term that was coined by a basic income participant, Tim Button, who simply said that I'm living proof that basic income works. So our book tries in a modest way to offer these stories and feelings of people who got the basic income in Ontario, in Lindsay and Hamilton. We hope that to keep these stories, that the book helps in some modest way to keep these stories alive. And we hope to accomplish what Elaine describes again as amplifying their voices. I've been reading a book by Viet Thanh Nguyen, who's an American novelist and academic, who talks about the world paying attention to the stories of the wealthy and the powerful, because those stories tend to reflect the people, or the stories of people who make decisions. The stories of the poor and the weak tend to be much less visible, except, of course, to those folks themselves. So we hope that the stories in this book generate empathy, not sympathy, because sympathy's first cousin is pity, but empathy's first cousin, we think, is solidarity. And that may be a goad or a help to an urge to action. Action that's often, as those of us who are involved in the basic income movement, as I see there are 58 of us on this call, we're often accused of being hopelessly romantic and utopian. But I personally think that basic income activists, we're conscious romantics, and we're goaded or inspired by the realism of the impossible. It sounds odd, but there you have it. So social movements historically have often been told that their demands for the abolition of slavery or the emancipation of women or working class rights are ridiculous and out of the question. We think that basic income needs to be on that same trajectory. So finally, and this will move over back to Elaine, stories surround us, literally. So think of standing in a supermarket lineup. If you don't use the self checkout, which I try never to do, you see glossy photos highlighting the marital problems of affluent celebrities. So there you are waiting for the cashier, and Brad is having trouble with Joan, and they're made split up, that kind of thing, and they literally surround us. So Elaine has one little story that we hope will illustrate that point.
Thanks, Jamie. So I want you to cast your memory back. I know I have a lot of holes in my memory, but I'll never forget what happened to me just as the pandemic was beginning. Remember that, a few weeks when there was no toilet paper on the shelves and all the cleaning supplies were gone. I was in a local big national chain grocery store here in Kingston. I needed to pick up a few things, and it was, I don't know, around 8 or 9 o'clock. It was later in the day, and the toilet paper aisle was completely empty. The cleaning supply was almost empty, but there was one section that clearly had just been restocked, and it was a can of some kind of antibacterial, antiseptic foam spray that claimed to kill everything for 24 hours. And I thought, well, I haven't really done anything to prepare for this pandemic. I guess we didn't really know at that point what it was going to be. So I thought, oh, well, what the heck? I might as well buy a can of this. Like, it's the only thing that's here on the shelf. So I took it along with the other things I went to the grocery store to the cashier. I didn't really look at those magazines that Jamie was talking about, but I put my groceries on the conveyor belt, and I put the can of antiseptic spray. And the cashier, who looked maybe a little bit younger than I am, probably in her 50s, she was looking at it very intently, and she asked where I got it, and we struck up a conversation. And it turned out that, here she is. This was before the plexiglass shields went up, before we were wearing masks. She was taking chemotherapy for cancer as it came out, as I continued to talk with her. And I just looked at her, and my heart broke, actually, because I thought, surely if you had a choice, I didn't say this to her, but I thought it, if you had a choice about whether to be in a grocery store checking out my groceries when your immune system is compromised and we know that a pandemic has begun, if you had a choice, surely you would not make this choice. You would be, if you could walk away from this job and know that you could still put groceries on the table yourself next month, surely that's what you would do to look after your health. And so that to me is one example of the cruelty, the terrible cruelty of our current system that forces people who are ill to work at great risk to themselves so that they can keep a roof over their head and food on the table. And I want a different Canada. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Jamie and Elaine. It's always inspiring to hear from you, and thank you for sharing that powerful story at the end there, Elaine. It's a really helpful reminder of what some people could be going through, people that we walk by every day, the people that we see in the grocery store, and how people's lives like that can be transformed by a basic income. And I'm partway through reading Jamie and Elaine's book right now, and I would highly recommend, whether you are new to basic income or you are very familiar with it, it's a great read. Our next speaker and our final speaker for this session is Leah Warner. Let me just highlight her on the screen right now. Oops. There we go. She's going to continue on the theme of the importance of storytelling by sharing some personal narratives from basic income recipients in Lindsay, Ontario. Based in Montreal, Leah has a background in anthropological research, writing, and teaching. She holds a bachelor's degree in English from McGill University and a master's degree in anthropology from Concordia University. She has conducted ethnographic research on the Ontario Basic Income Pilot Project and is interested in emerging narratives surrounding basic income and the ways basic income can help us reimagine social values surrounding work and poverty. Leah, take it away.
Thank you so much, Walid, and thank you so much to your talks. I'm really honored to be on this session, especially, and with all of you who I really admire. I'm actually joining you from Berlin, where it's late afternoon, and I'm just going to share my screen, which I have been instructed in, so I hope it works. There we go. Should work. Yeah, as Walid said, I will also be talking about stories and about the powerful effect they can have in advocacy work on basic income. And my research is based on field work that I did for my master's thesis in anthropology, and the title is on the slide here, and it sort of broadly explores the way that basic income captures the imagination of project participants and members within the community in Lindsay, which was, as you probably all know, one of the test sites in the Ontario pilot. So it's qualitative research, and so it reflects my own interpretations. That's important to note. And I want to acknowledge also once again everyone that were so generous and shared their stories with me for this research. So what was distinctive about Lindsay was that it was the city in the pilot that had the most people on basic income per capita out of the different test sites. So approximately 10% of the population of around 20,000 were enrolled in the pilot. And when I started my field work, which was in the summer of 2019, so a few years ago now, it wasn't long after that participants had received their last checks after the cancellation. And you could really feel that the cancellation hung over the interviews I conducted. But at the same time, many of the people I spoke to, and they would share to me, what had come out of the existence was also a feeling of hope. And the sense of an opening and a window through which they could begin to imagine something else and something better for themselves and also for their community. In the first part of the research, I focused on personal narratives. And of course, I'm summarizing just as a note. So there's a lot more to these stories than I can kind of describe here. But what I found through these interviews with former basic income participants was that the experience of being on basic income felt and was imagined fundamentally differently than the other forms of social assistance that most of them are on. And the quotes I have here on the slides are from women I interviewed in Lindsay, and they were on basic income for about a year, and before that, and now again on Ontario Disability Support. And these names are also all pseudonyms. So one describes the feeling before going on basic income as that of going down a dark alley late at night. It's unsafe and there isn't any sense of light. Another is that what you see for your future is akin to a dead end. And then on basic income, Diane tells me that she was finally able to get ahead. Joni, that she felt suffocated by being on disability insurance, but that on basic income, she felt like she could breathe more freely. Fiona, that it was a major life changer for her. And Rose tells me that, you know, either you have to sink or swim, and being on basic income, she felt like she was swimming, and then she kind of went back to sinking again. And as the last one, which is kind of evocative, it was incredible, the possibilities that it gave us, the fact that it even gave us possibilities. And this is kind of what I wanted to stress, because it was beyond the material conditions that became possible just because of having more money. There was also something that stirred the imagination of people. There is a sense of more space to begin to imagine something else for their futures in the present. And one concept I worked with just briefly, I think captures kind of this really well, and it's existential mobility. So it's a sense that a viable or worthwhile life presupposes a form of imaginary mobility, or a sense that one is going somewhere, a path. So it's kind of a feeling of being robbed of this capacity to imagine better and different things for your life. And I thought about it with Jamie, you kind of brought this up with like a narrative scarcity or narrative inequality. It's a feeling of being stuck, and it's really difficult when you have so little and you're constantly reminded of these narratives around poverty and unemployment that you're not really deserving. And this is kind of what began to shift when they went on basic income, although, you know, unfortunately only temporarily. And so this impact that I think a policy like basic income, with the kind of new stories surrounding it, can have is really powerful. And it was also something that I found expressed in the community. So in the second part of my research, and it's sort of two parts also in this presentation, I explored the impacts of storytelling. So the telling and sharing of personal stories about being on basic income and its role in advocacy work. And I began to think of a sort of a shared narrative or story around basic income, which comes from the storytelling. And is made up of these, you know, these personal stories. And I think also the session kind of is that in a sense and reflects that. So what I found was that storytelling was really central to a lot of the advocacy work, but also at the heart of the conversations and the events that was happening in Lindsay at this time, as well as also a way of coping with the effects of the cancellation. You know, because one of the things that had been unique was that so many people in a relatively small community had been on basic income. So there was a transformation from this like theoretical idea to something that was personal, something connected to someone you might know, or someone you know knows. Local businesses starting or improving because of more customers, being able to buy healthier food, taking care of sick relatives or dependent children, being able to move into a bigger place, a place without mold, ones of women being able to leave abusive relationships. And one participant lived in a public housing building where most of the residents were on basic income. And she told me, and it felt like there were less ambulances coming to and from the building, that it felt like there were less fights between tenants and people seemed to kind of be walking more upright. So this feeling of hope wasn't just individually felt, but it was also something that was kind of shared in a sense. And a last aspect that I wanted to mention is that these stories also work to create a kind of social legitimacy. And this was, of course, partial and nothing totalizing, but in a conservative community or conservative leaning community where a lot of people are not traditionally pro quote unquote government handouts and have this attitude of, as one participant described to me, if you aren't working, you aren't worth anything. It shifted in a sense in some moments because there was a normalization, because there were so many people on it. As one advocate put it, when you have 1 in 10 on basic income in the community, everyone will know someone or know someone who knows someone on it. So in this way, the focus shifts in a sense from whether people deserve free money and towards a kind of, look, this is positive and hopeful and all this is going on. And there is something, inevitably compelling about hopeful stories. And this, my final quote here also talks about, this is also an advocate and a participant in the pilot. And she also kind of puts it nicely, because you simply understand people's perspectives through stories. And in this way, they were kind of transformational. And I think when we talk about data versus, or hard data versus stories or anecdotes, we separate them. And I think, a good case can be made for that there is no separation as such, like the lines and boundaries are thin. And so they can kind of contribute to changing the narrative or form a counter narrative. It speaks back to these narratives we want to change, made up from real experiences that don't necessarily hold any strict political ideology or stance. And so I thought I would conclude with a quote. Conclude the talks of this about storytelling with a quote on stories. And it's by Carol McGranahan. And she writes, "The world's built through stories create truths. They do not just hold them or represent them. Stories give frameworks to hopes, to morals, and to politics." And I think this speaks really nicely as to why it's important to keep sharing these stories, and why, both for advocates and participants and those who are the main characters of the stories in advocacy work going forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Leah. I really enjoyed how you discussed your research, both from the lens of the actual stories themselves and your research on the impact that it had on people's lives, but then also actually digging into why storytelling is important, and your research looking at that as well. And I thought it was a great way to conclude all of our presentations for today. Now we have some time for a question and answer period. I see we have everybody except Jamie, who should be joining us soon. But if you have any questions, please just submit them using the Ask a Question button at the bottom. One question that has come up is, and I'm paraphrasing here, let me just pull it up, is that the journey to print through other hands, minds, and goals leaves room for alteration. Does anybody, and this is open to all of our speakers, do you have any thoughts on the factors and revelation of storytelling, and kind of the comment discussed earlier? Yeah, Elaine, please go ahead.
That's such a great question. And I think one of the most gratifying responses to the book, to Jamie's and my book, is just that people, participants, the people we feature in the book, have said that they feel that it's sensitive and representative. As a qualitative researcher, I know it's really important to try to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Yeah, I follow the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who has a fancy sociological theory about the logic of practice, but it kind of boils down to putting yourself in someone else's shoes and being able to imagine yourself that if you were in the same situation, that you would do pretty much the same thing because of the constraints. That can be really hard, I think, when you're a researcher who occupies a pretty privileged position, to put that aside and to try to understand. It's really about, I think, about understanding, Jamie, there, about understanding with enough depth that you can put your own prejudices. Evelyn talked about, being confronted by some of her own biases, to be able to put that aside and actually really hear the voice of the person that you're trying to represent. It's always active interpretation, but I think when the participant can recognize themselves in that story, then we've done a pretty good job.
Thank you, Elaine, for kicking us off. I think that was a great answer. Does anybody else want to chime in? Yeah, Hannah, please go.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think that for us, what we made sure, because that's a great question. It's always going to be up for interpretation, you as a writer. And so how we approached our project was to make sure that all the participants in the book were okay with what they shared. I had multiple meetings with each person involved. I made sure that they would read their chapters, they were able to read their direct quotes, and they had full creative control over what they wanted in and what they didn't want in. So I think it was also just really key to have the transparency with the people involved and to make sure that we're honoring their stories in a way that they're okay with. And so I think that was really important for us to just make sure that our participants were involved in the process the entire time they were going through it, and everything that's been printed or is going to be printed is things that they're okay with having in there and that we're okay with printing about them.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really simple and smart way to address the question, and making sure that as writers, you're not kind of spinning the narrative.
Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, Jamie.
Okay, I can't hear anybody, so I'll just continue blithely, doing lip reading or something.
Well, maybe
Elaine will not be surprised of my my incompetence with respect to these kinds of things.
Well, we'll try to get your audio up in a second, JB. But in the meanwhile, does anybody, Leah or Evelyn, anything to add to the question? Yeah, please go ahead, Evelyn.
I think I'm unmuted. Sorry. I don't know if my sound is any better. I think that one of the things we were quite conscious of was the ownership of the stories. And for example, we didn't anonymize people in the book because people wanted to own the stories. They wanted their names attached to the stories that they told. And that's a kind of an interesting way of dealing with story. But the other side of it is that stories do take on a life of their own. And they do change as they're told from person to person to person. And I think that that's something we just have to be aware of as we're dealing with narrative.
Yeah, thanks, Evelyn. And it's important to acknowledge that you can almost never tell the story exactly the way with them, but just and to do the best that we can. See a couple more questions that come in. Go to somebody is asking, what medium or how can they dig into a story is most impactful based on your own experience? Does the public respond more if stories are presented in writing versus video? Do you notice anything experiences comment on that?
I guess I could say they're both. They maybe they reach different audiences, and maybe they're more effective combined. So I think we probably need both the visual, the video, and the written. I don't know that different people will respond in different ways to video versus text, but I don't know that I don't have a clear answer for that. I think it's a good question, but probably we need as many stories and as many documentaries as we can get.
And I think also, oral storytelling is also important. And I guess what we're thinking of here is on a broader level, but I think it's also important to think of it on a communal level and a personal level, that the stories that that we tell each other face to face. I mean, obviously it's COVID, so that has been really difficult. So I guess we think of it as video, but you know, once we return.
Yeah, thank you, Leah. And I'll just, Jamie, actually, is your audio working now?
It is. I'm working on several senses at once, which is a miracle for me. One thing I wanted to add about the issue of stories and storytelling, and we've talked a lot about the stories of people who are on basic income, and that's where the research has focused. But I think it's important to note that at least our book tries to tell the stories of people who are involved in the social movement for basic income, because social movements are what will, or this social movement will animate and lead to the success of basic income for a more egalitarian society. And there are three people, at least on this call, who are also in our book, and I just thought I'd name them. We have Evelyn up there in the top left, who gets the last word in our book, and she's a very, very important participant in this social movement. We have Tom Cooper, who is here as well, and he's been very important in Hamilton. And we also have John Mills, who I met in Winnipeg in 2016 at the NABIG Congress, who told an extremely compelling story of his own struggles, even though he was not on the basic income pilot. So I think it's that the tales or the insights of people who've been involved in a struggle for social change are really, really important. So that's my little 2 cents now that I can talk and hear at the same time.
Well, thank you, Jamie. I think you close us off on a very inspirational note. And I think that is a great thing to keep in mind as everybody goes through all of the different sessions of the Congress over the next couple of days. That's all that we have for today, recognizing that we're a couple of minutes over. I just wanted to thank all of our panelists for coming out today and sharing their own insights, and also sharing the stories of other people who have been on a basic income, or people who lead difficult lives who could benefit from a basic income. And we'd also like to thank everybody in the audience for taking the time out of their day to attend our session, and choosing this session over all of the other great sessions that NABIG is hosting today and tomorrow. Before we sign off, I just wanted to highlight a couple of sessions that people might be interested in. One is featuring Elaine tomorrow, titled "No One Left Behind: Income Security for the 21st Century," which is about research and social media advocacy, and that will take place tomorrow morning, and might get at some of the questions asked about how effective different mediums are.
Elaine is everywhere.
That is true. Elaine is in multiple sessions this weekend. And then also, we also have 2 keynote sessions today, one about the intersectionality of basic income, and one about ongoing cash transfer pilots in the US and Canada. So on that note, I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the conference, and thank you very much for coming out today. Take care.